Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be doing a still life in ink and watercolour. This was originally created for Skillshare, but unfortunately due to some occasional background noise it wasn't allowed over there. So I'm very sorry to those of you that do follow me on Skillshare that this isn't available there and is only available here on YouTube. And to those of you that only follow me on YouTube, this is a bit of an indication of what we do over on Skillshare. So you will see that the classes are broken down into easy to follow segments, and there are breaks there between each course because I originally created the video in that format and I've just put them all together into one big long video for YouTube. Okay, so let me know what you think about it down in the comments below, and I hope you find it useful and you enjoy it, and we'll go on to the rest of the video. Thank you. Hello and welcome to my latest Skillshare course. I'm Callie, and in this course we're going to be looking at doing a very simple still life in ink and watercolour. Still lives are a really good way for a beginner to painting and drawing to get some practice in. It makes you observe, it makes you really look, and it's a good way to practice your measuring. I would suggest that you only choose 2 or 3 objects. If you get too many more than that, you're going to overcomplicate it, overwhelm yourself and become frustrated. Sticking to 2 or 3 things is going to help you to simplify things. So we've probably all been to classes on here and things where when you're very new to drawing, you set off by drawing one apple, and really this is just an expansion out from that, doing 2 or 3 things. So the thing with still life is, what I would usually do, and a good tip for you, is to choose things that would naturally be found together. So the items that I'm using are all found together in the kitchen. So don't take something from the kitchen, something from the bathroom and something from outside. They're not going to gel together because they don't look like they fit together. So if you want, you could pop outside and get something like a conker, an autumn leaf and some blackberries, and they would look lovely together. Or if you pop into your living room, you might see there that you've got a diary and a pen and a pair of reading glasses, something like that. Things that would normally be found together will look nice together in general. There's always exceptions to the rule. You might want to do something really wacky to build a narrative around that, for example, in the future. But for now, let's stick to things that gel well together. Make a nice little setting. I usually put mine on a white piece of paper, and what you want to do is sit them as far away as you can, well, not as far away as you can, that sounds silly, but a good distance in front of you so that your eye is relaxed. When things are too close to you, or indeed too far away from you, your eyes are straining. So you want your eyes to be relaxed, you want them to be a nice distance away, and you want to have a comfortable seating position to begin with. So think about that to begin with. Put your still life together on a piece of white paper so that it shows up all the shadows, and think about the composition a little bit. You might want to get some height in there, which I've done with the jug, but in general 2 or 3 things just sat together, just sort of let them sit higgledy-piggledy if you like, and just have a bit of a play around and see what looks pleasing to your eye. So we're going to be working in ink and watercolour. If you want, you can just do it in pencil, that's entirely up to you, and if you want to work in pencil and add more paint than I have, you can do that as well. I didn't add very much paint because I wanted the freshness of that white paper to come through to make a nice simple fresh drawing, just with a little bit of paint over the top to give us a hint of the colour and the tone. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the measurements and the ways of measuring things and looking at things against each other. So lining things up, see where things line up together, and measurements against each other. So whether that's twice the size of something else or, you know, that kind of thing is a very good way of getting your drawings accurate. So we'll start with that now, and I'll come back to you at the end and see how we've gone on. To begin this exercise, once you're happy with the placement of your objects, you're going to need a nice watercolour paper. I've got a Bockingford block which is gummed all the way around. And you're also going to need a pencil and an eraser. Make sure it's a good quality eraser and try it out first so that it isn't going to smudge on or tear your paper. You don't want a cheap eraser really. And always clean the end off on a rough piece of paper so that you're not going to be putting any marks onto your paper if you do need to use it. So measuring is the first thing, and getting some lines down to begin with that we're going to fit that composition into. So when you're looking at the objects in front of you, and your objects may be completely different to mine, don't think of them as a tomato or a piece of garlic or a jug. Think of them as shapes and lines, and you'll find it much easier. And even when you go on to drawing perhaps people or houses, whatever you're doing, if you think of it as a series of lines and shapes and measurements, you're going to find your drawing a lot easier than if you're panicking thinking, is this going to look like a person, etc. So just concentrate on the measurements and then you'll find the drawing makes itself in a way after a time. I'm sorry, there's a fly around here irritating me, so if I start flapping about, that's what it is. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to make it slightly bigger than I can see it there. So if you're going to alter it and make it bigger onto the paper, you need to make sure that you do all your measurements rounded up by the same amount. So I'm going to do it twice as big, which is an easy one to do. So I'll do my measurement and then I'll do it twice. And make sure you do that for every item. Now, if you really wanted to, and if you weren't confident about measuring by eye, you could get a ruler and you could go over to the objects and measure them and then translate that to your paper. That's entirely up to you. As long as you use the same method throughout, so that each object and the whole thing is in scale to each other, then that's absolutely fine. But one of the best ways of measuring is by comparing items to each other and by taking these measurements using your pencil. So we've all seen artists going like this and you wonder what they're doing, and we know it's to do with measuring. Basically, you're looking from a distance and the object, let's say you're measuring the eraser, is fitting into that size. So you're putting your thumb there and then you're taking that measurement from there to there and transferring it to your paper. Very, very simple. So that's simple, but the thing that makes you go wrong with this is by moving. So once your chair is comfortable and you're a comfortable space from the table, so you've got room to move your arms when you're drawing, you make sure you don't move again, or you make sure you know exactly where your chair is, perhaps line it up with the floorboards or whatever, so that when you come back you're sat in the same place. Because if you move your body and your arm, your measurement's going to be different every time. That's why you want a locked arm, so have your elbow locked. If you take one measurement with your arm outstretched and then the next measurement with your arm back here, they're not going to compare to each other, they're going to be completely wrong. So make sure your arm's always in the same position and make sure your body's in the same position so you get those measurements correct. Okay, so I'm going to set off, and if we look at the whole thing as a whole, so don't break these shapes down yet into round tomatoes and and the jug and everything. Look at the whole thing, and it's fitting slightly into a bit of an L shape there. So the first measurement I'm going to do is going to be from the tip of the jug down to the base of the apple in the foreground, which pretty much fits into a straight line. And if I look, I'll hold my arm out straight and I'll put my finger where the bottom of the tomato is, and that's the length of it. So we start here and we go to there, and don't forget we're doubling it, so we come right down to here, and then I'm going to draw in those lines up. So that's the measurement from the tip of the jug. You won't be able to see this on the camera there, but just a nice straight line from the tip of the jug down to the front of the tomato. So the next measurement is going to be from the bottom, from this corner here, and go as far across as where the garlic finishes. So that's there. I'll just check I've got that right, and then we need to do it again, so it takes us right over here. So those are actually pretty similar measurements. So if we just go back and we can double check, so this is a good thing to double check. You've got the edge of the tomatoes to the edge of the garlic, only slightly more than the edge of the jug to the bottom of the tomato, so you know you've got that right if that looks similar on there. Okay, so now the next one I'm going to take is from the top of the jug to the end of the top of the handle, which is there. We need to do it twice. So this is where you can go wrong. If you just did that once and forgot that you were doubling up, you would then have that measurement wrong. So once you've started doubling it up, do it all the way through. And don't forget, yours is going to be slightly different to this if you've chosen a different composition and different items. So now we're going to go, and we're going to ignore at the moment the tip of the garlic. There's a stem coming off the garlic, and just go down to the top of the actual bulb from the top of the handle there, which again is about there. Need to double it, so there. And then from there it actually slopes down. So we know where it comes to. It comes right here. I should have measured that a little bit. 1, 2. So that line's actually slightly angled. So we've got that sort of L shape. So we know that the whole composition fits in that, apart from that stem of garlic that's going to be up here somewhere. So there are going to be things breaking your line. Just pick out the most obvious lines to you that's going to give you a framework to work into. So you know that you've kind of got a safety net, if you like. You've got this framework that you're going into there. Okay, so once you've got that, then you need to start thinking about the individual shapes within that composition. Okay, so once you've got your outline, which of course could be completely different to mine depending on what objects you've got in front of you, you want to start looking at them all individually. And I'm going to start at the front with the most obvious shape, which is that little tomato. They're pretty much the same size. They were in one of those packets that's, you know, got about 6 tomatoes in that were all the same size. So don't forget we're doubling up. So that's how far it comes. It comes to there. I am aware that you can't see much that's going on this paper at the moment. Don't worry about that. It's more about what I'm saying at the moment, explaining how to, and I won't do the whole thing, just the way that we're using this method of measuring. So, and it's the same height as it is width. So we've got this little box here that first tomato is going to fit in. So we can put that in. It's not exactly round because it's sort of goes a bit flat on the end where the, what do you call it, where the stem comes out. We can refine all these lines later on. We're just placing the objects. So that's all we're doing at the moment, is placing things where they're going to go. We're not worrying about the detail, we're not worrying about the light and the tone, we're just placing the objects. So if we look at the next tomato behind it, it's coming out halfway along this one. It's the same size and it's peeping out here. So again, we'll do that measurement. And then the same again. Sorry, I've lost it. So this is why you have to keep looking back with your arm out. So you can see that's very similar to the first tomato. Like I say, they're in one of those little boxes. And do the measurement up, where you get, you know, 6 on the vine that are all the same. So we've got another cube there, hidden behind the one in front, because don't forget that's behind. And we can put that, so going out and round, and again it's slightly flatter on the bottom. They're not perfect spheres, but we can refine those shapes afterwards. And I'm just going to place where that little top is, because we can see it on that one, whereas we couldn't on that one. So those are in the right place now. We don't really need to worry too much about that stem at the moment, but we could pop it in. It's coming up in a line from here. And this isn't a straight shape, it's a little bit bent, so it goes off at an angle there. And it comes from this one. Okay, so we'll leave that for now. That's enough detail. We'll come back and do the detail later. So I'm not going to go and talk through all the jug and all the garlic, because like I said, you might have something different. What I wanted to talk about really was doing this outline shape to begin with, then doing the measurements for the shapes that come within that. But don't just measure the tomato or the jug, or measure the negative space. So when we talk about negative space, let me just pop my cup there and my eraser there and my pencil there. You might think to begin with drawing the outline of the eraser, which is fine. That's exactly what I've just done with the tomato. But there's another shape there going on, and that's this shape. And these shapes are what we refer to as negative shapes. So it's a shape, but it's not the shape of the object. It's a shape of the space between the object. So once you've drawn those tomatoes and then you've drawn the garlic, look at that negative shape. Is it this shape that you can see? And if it is, your drawing's obviously correct. And this is another negative shape. And obviously down here, there's all sorts of areas that are negative shapes. So look at those and see if they look correct as well. Don't just look and see whether the shape of the tomato is correct, look at what's around it. I'm hoping that makes sense to you, and I'm saying that clearly. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead now, finish my pencil drawing, and I'll come back to you when I've put some ink on and you can see those lines there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that drawing process. So once you've got all your items in position with those rough guidelines with your pencil, you can go on and do your ink drawing like I have done. Now, there are one or two things to watch with ink. Obviously you can't erase it, so you need to be quite confident with it. But because we've got those pencil lines there to begin with, we can, just work within those lines and we should be okay. So one little tip for doing ink drawing, it's quite difficult to draw a complete line all in one and have it correct every time. Even with your pencil lines there, it's much easier to do a series of soft little lines like this, and you can gradually build that line up and make it darker if you want to, but you're less likely to go wrong if you just do tiny little dashes to begin with until you're more confident. Now the shadows, they're quite complicated on here because I've got a lot of different light sources, and again your light sources will be completely different to mine. I've done the shadows a little bit on the objects. I've obviously not done any shadows actually underneath them, so they look a bit like they're floating at the moment. We're going to do that with the paint, we're not going to do that with the ink. So on the garlic itself, some of these lines are the actual papery bit of the garlic, and some of them are shadows. So again, that makes life a little bit more complicated to try and distinguish between the two. And each bulb is also, sorry, that's the whole bulb, isn't it? Each clove, should I say, is also not a perfect shape. They're quite, they sometimes have flat sides and things, so then they will cast a shadow where they've got those flat sides, if you see what I mean there. Okay, so and you can go on and reinforce some of those shapes as well later on with your pen. So try not to be too heavy with the pen. We've got quite delicate objects here. We've got a white jug, we've got the white in the garlic. We don't want to be making it really, really black if we can help it. You might want to just do pencil and concentrate more on your painting. That's absolutely fine as well, as long as we've got those measurements right, we've got everything where they're going. So the tomatoes themselves, and this applies to all of the items on this particular one actually, they've got a lot of curves, they're quite spherical, so when you're putting your shadows in, make sure you sort of go around the object, and that's going to make those curves more obvious and make it more 3D. So here you can see we've gone around the jug with some lines and down it with others to make it that little fat jug that it is. One thing about these observational drawings and studying a little still life like this is you look more at everyday objects that you wouldn't normally study. And I've noticed with this jug that I thought was just a simple little jug that's been in the cupboard for years, what a complicated shape it is and how odd it is really, because the handle is out of proportion with the jug really, but that's how it is. So it makes you think and it makes you look. Okay, so I'm going to leave the ink now, and we'll get some watercolours. And I think what I'm going to do first, and I think you should perhaps do this as well, I'm going to work wet on dry to make the whole process a lot easier and simpler. And we'll keep the painting quite simple so that we've just got these nice lines showing through of the drawing. We don't want to obliterate the drawing, but we'll do the shadows first and leave them to dry, because they're quite complicated shadows and they are going to change as the day goes on. So I want to get those in. I'll do those while they're drying. I'm going to go off and have some lunch and then come back and we'll put some more colour in. Obviously the main colour is going to be the tomato. There's not a lot of colour in the rest of it. I'm going to keep these shadow colours very, very simple. So I'm going to make up some violet, and the violet I have here is Windsor Violet. And I don't want them too concentrated, I want them nice and watery. And I'm just going to put a bit of cerulean blue in that, just to make it slightly more on the blue side quite a cool shadow. Tiny touch more water. We don't, like I said, we don't want this to be really thick. We want the paper to shine through. We want it to be nice and light. So plenty of water and not too much pigment. So I've got cerulean blue and violet. You can do your shadow colours whatever you fancy. And I'm going to make another one up here. Tiny bit of water and again some violet and some of the cerulean. And that is a lot thicker than that. So we've got the same colour but much thicker. So how many of the shadows you put in? They're quite complex. I think we would perhaps want to simplify them. I've got light from all sources. I've got a light above. I've got light bouncing off the white walls behind. I've got several windows in here. So we want to keep it quite simple, and we'll start at the back with the jug. If you want to put light pencil lines in to do this, then you can. I'm just doing it by eye, and I can see that that shadow starts about here somewhere and it goes out, and we've got the shape of the tip of the jug bending round, and then it comes down to line up with here. So just a small shadow, and you want to do these quite quickly because you don't want it drying on you. And having lines within it. Okay, and while that's still wet, get a tiny touch on your brush of the darker one and put that into the edge where the object is, where you want it slightly darker, and then leave that, and don't come back to it, leave that to completely dry. You'll just see there, this brush is a bit of a nuisance for flicking colour about. There's just one or two little spots gone on there. You won't be able to see that, but tiny spots. It sometimes kind of flicks. I've got to be careful how I use it. I like this brush, but it does have that about it. Okay, and the handle one is coming from here and up and there. So I'm going carefully around that garlic. That's partly handle and partly the jug, I think. Like I say, they're quite complicated shadows. And again, sorry, I'll get rid of that. Some of the darker colour, whilst it's wet, and it must be wet to do this, into the jug there. And that just gives you a bit of variety in your tone, because of course they're not uniform, completely all one tone. So I'm going to move down to the tomatoes. This one's just got a tiny shadow underneath. So I'm really doing the shadows that are coming from above. There's some slightly more complicated shadows going on from the windows and things. Some of them lighter, some of them crisscrossing. I'm going to leave those. And again, that thicker one underneath this tomato where there's very little light getting under here. So plenty of that thicker paint underneath there. And don't forget, with watercolours, these are all going to dry much lighter than they go on, and don't forget that at the moment they're really standing out because that's the only colour on the paper. So eventually, once we've got the colour on the tomatoes, etc., these are going to not just be just as obvious. So like you did with your actual drawing of your objects earlier, you can measure these shadows as well to make sure you're getting them right if you don't want to just trust your eye. But just compare them to the objects, so that's got sort of less than half the width of the tomato there. And already that looks more like those tomatoes are sat on a table rather than floating in mid-air. Just drying this brush off and tidying up that little edge there, because they are very distinct. They're not fuzzy edges to the shadows because we put them on that white paper. Okay, so now the garlic, and again it's very dark underneath the garlic here. No lights getting down there. And this is actually all one piece of garlic, which made it very complicated to draw because, you know, you've got the papery bits as well as the clove bits. And it's all kind of torn apart, so you want to get that papery feeling of the torn shapes there. Perhaps not the easiest object to have chosen, but something nice to study and take your time over. So this is a bit of papery stuff that's sort of come off the side there of the garlic, making that nice shape. And again, that really looks now like those are sat on the table rather than floating. And I'm hoping some of you might have noticed a mistake that I've made, or not actually a mistake, something that I haven't done that I should be doing. And that is this shadow of the stem. Obviously there's going to be a shadow up here. One or two different light sources. I'm not going to put that darker because it's not very dark, that shadow there. Okay, and you perhaps won't be able to see it, but the these colours with this violet and the, so I'm just going to turn that around to get a nicer edge on there. The violet and the cerulean quite often granulates and makes the colours kind of move away from each other. And there's some lovely pinks coming out of this that are obviously in that Windsor violet, so there's some really nice colours going on there. So I'm fiddling where I shouldn't be fiddling because I'm wanting those edges to be nice and crisp, but really once you've got that second colour, the second mix in, you probably want to leave it. Okay, so I'm going to leave this to completely dry now, and then I'll come back to it afterwards, after I've had my lunch. Now all those shadows are nice and dry, I'm going to start with doing the shadows on the jug. And what I'm going to do for that, I'm going to add a little bit more water to this first mix. Just don't forget, if you go off and have your lunch or something like that, or especially if you leave things until the next day, some of that water will evaporate, so it won't be just as strong as it was. So I've added some more water. I'm also going to add some more cerulean so that it's more on the blue side than the violet side. And actually a little bit more water. So it's a really watery blue mix of the colour that we had before. So there's all sorts of shadows and highlights on this jug, and we could spend a lot of time getting really involved with it. But just again, like we did with these, just pick out the most obvious ones, look at where it's the darkest. Sometimes if you half close your eyes and kind of squint, it shows up the tones. So that's one good way of doing it. But you know, there's lots and lots going on in all different directions, so you really want to just pick out the most obvious ones and make something of them. So it's really in shadow here, and actually some of these are already there with your ink shading, your cross hatching. We all have different ways of using ink to make shadows. If you cross hatch or whatever, just little crosses, little dots. So that goes right down into there, that shadow. It's obviously the darkest bit, no light's getting under there. And I'm just going to lightly add some, because of course it's white, we want to keep this painting nice and fresh. So I'm going to leave a lot of white paper on this jug. In areas like this you can use the side of your brush just to give some indications of light and shade. Partially dry brush as well is quite nice for that. So when I say dry brush, really you're keeping your brush nice and dry and just having a little bit of paint on, and then when you take it to the side like that you get these little bits of light where the dry paper is. So just see there, it's running out of paint, so that's what we call a dry brush technique. So that's something you could practice on a rough piece of paper. See lots of shadows around the handle underneath where the light can't reach it at all. And this is all going to add shape to your object as well. And we can leave that to dry, and if we feel some areas need to be slightly darker we can always put another layer on. So now I'm going to come to the tomatoes. And first of all I'm going to do the whole thing yellow, and I'm going to use a nice bright yellow. Oops, that needs cleaning out. So I use a cadmium yellow. And just cover the whole thing and leave it to dry. But if I look at these now, and you won't be able to see it, but they've got a lovely light on them where the light's shining, where it's completely white. So I'm just going to leave an area of paper unpainted for that highlight, which is just here. And then the rest of it, just leave a couple of areas there where the light's catching, because of course they're very, very smooth. They've got a smooth skin, which means that the light catches them much more easily and shines. So I'm actually going to cover the stem as well whilst I've got this yellow, because of course it's green, so having that underneath will be a nice colour to work on top of with some of the green afterwards. And again, look again, this has got a highlight, so leave an area of dry white paper, and then everything else is coloured yellow. So again, I've got plenty of water in this mix. I don't want it to be too thick and too heavy to cover up all those lines there of the drawing. Now if we look at the garlic, it's actually the areas where it's still covered in paper on the inside, if that makes sense, is a little bit kind of peachy coloured. So I'm going to add some water to this and add some alizarin, and I want that nice and light, so plenty of water. Might even add a little bit more water. So I'm looking at it from here, it's just these pieces that are, I don't know what the word is for, the kind of, they're still covered with the outer part of the papery shell, whereas some are much lighter and whiter because they have been opened into. And again, if you want to make this darker anywhere, you can come on with another layer afterwards. So it's best to do it pale to begin with and build it up. So working wet onto dry paper or wet onto dry paint is a good way to work if you're not that confident, because you can just very slowly and gradually build tones up. I quite like the colour of that, but I do feel it perhaps needs to be a little bit deeper in areas. So we'll leave that to dry, and then I'll look at the colour of the rest of it, and the rest of it is not quite white, it's off-white, and I think the best way to make that colour, with plenty of water, a tiny bit of this into it, and an extra bit of the alizarin, because it's sort of pinky in places. In fact, in some places it's almost purpley pink. So we might put that purpley colour on top. So I'm just going to do the whole thing. As you can see, it's nearly white. It's just a tiny touch of colour, so it's different from the surrounding paper. It's a lovely colour. Hoping it will show up when I take a photograph of it afterwards. Just move my paper. So just covering everything other than those bits that we've already done with the more peachy colour. There aren't the same highlights on the garlic as there are on the tomatoes and the jug, because that papery kind of, it's textured, isn't it? It's not smooth like the other two, so it's absorbing the light. It's not, we haven't got that shine on it there. Okay, so we'll leave that to dry, and then we'll come back with another layer. So I'm just going to go over and make some of these layers slightly darker, so slightly deeper, by using the same colours on top mostly. So in the jug, the absolute darkest area for the jug is here. So just another touch over the top. And down the sides. And that's just introducing a little bit of variety into those shadows there, and that's going to be enough, I think, for the jug. We want to leave it quite simple. So for the tomatoes, I've actually mixed together, whilst I was waiting for that to dry, I've mixed together a cadmium red, and I've put quite a lot of alizarin in to get the colour of the tomatoes. And don't forget that yellow's going to shine through as well. We may need 3 layers of this because we might want to add some extra shadows. So I'm going around those highlights that we left. They're a little bit more round than that. I'm trying to make them a bit round. Don't overdo highlights, less is more. Have more impact if there are fewer of them. But just again, squint with your eyes, look to where the very lightest areas are. By half closing your eyes, they'll kind of jump out a little bit more with the tones. And if you're not sure about your tones, you can, and where your highlights and darkest shadows are, take a photograph of what's in front of you with your smartphone and then convert it into black and white. So the same thing again with this one. So this is really making these tomatoes look very dominant, but of course they are, because they're bright red and everything else on the table is much lighter in colour. The white jug and the almost white garlic. You won't be able to see from the camera there, but can you remember how I just put some extra shadows on the jug? Where I've painted the tomato here, it's just hit that area that was wet, and run into it a little bit. So with a very dry brush, so you squeeze all the moisture out of your brush, you can just catch that and stop it spreading any further. You'd hardly be able to see it, to be honest with you. Okay, so now the stem. So I've got some sap green and I've added to that some alizarin as well. And if I look at the stem, it's not just a uniform green all the way along. There are areas of light and dark, so leave some of the yellow there, some of the paper, and just kind of tickle the paint along, leave some edges where the light's catching it, so it's not all completely uniform. You could make that slightly darker, but I think that's quite nice as it is. We've got the darks there with the pen anyway. Okay, so this peachy colour, did you recall I said it looks a little bit lilac-y in places? I'm going to just pinch a little bit of that lilac and mix it into there. And it's where you can kind of sit shining through that paper is the garlic underneath in these first three cloves here. 1, 2, 3. Just a tiny, tiny touch. And that really helps with the shape. Now this top part is very, very white, and that's actually got a shadow down the side of it, so I'm going to use a little bit of this for the shadow there. Just adding those 1 or 2 shadows to the papery areas helps make that more 3D as well. So again, all this is what I'm calling paper. It's obviously not paper, but these papery bits need a little bit more shadow on them. So only a tiny touch. This one needs to be darker in tone, so I'm going to add the peach colour that we made was this one, wasn't it, with a little bit of the alizarin again. On the edges here. And it slightly warms it up as well, that's a nice warm colour. There's a little bit of this colour in here. And this is one of those where you can keep looking back at it and seeing more and more shadow and more colour. But at some point you've got to say, no, let's leave it. So I'm just going to leave it to dry for now, and the only ones I'm going to come back to are the tomatoes, to put a few more shadows on and to put the centre of that tomato in there. Okay, so to get some darker shadows on the tomatoes, I'm just going to add some of the Windsor Violet into that red that we had, and that's just one tiny touch of violet. I don't want to make it really, really dark. And just look at where it's absolutely the darkest and put a few little extra shadows on, but not overdoing it. So down here the light really can't get to this area underneath. Like I said before with the drawing, take your brush around the fruit, get those shapes moving. Okay, so not the whole thing. And here they kind of dip in, don't they, to where the little stem is, if that makes sense. So just look at that as well and get all that. Again, move your brush in the direction of some of those shadows. And then I'm just going to get some of that green and the yellow as well mixed together. Just put on here because it's not very dark at all, it's just a tiny touch of green. In fact, I'm just going to get a little bit of yellow straight from the pan and mix that in. Nice light area there. Okay, I think that's about it. Was there anything else I said I was going to come back and do? Maybe just pop more of that little pinky colour that we made on there. Okay, I think I could be in danger of overdoing it. I did say we want to keep this really simple, If you did want to just do it in pencil very lightly and then really concentrate on your painting and not do as much line work with the pen, then you could do it that way, letting it dry in between each layer and gradually building up those tones. But I'm going to leave it as this little simple ink and wash drawing there that we've got. And I'm just having a look. Got a little smudge there. It's a smudge of red from the tomato. You probably can't see it, but red's very difficult to lift out of the paper. It dyes the paper. I think hardly anyone would notice that. Okay, so that's as much as I'm going to do to it. If you wanted to, you could obviously draw a table and you could draw a background, but I think it looks nice just with those very, very simple shadows underneath, just as it is with that nice expanse of white paper around it. There's something really fresh about the whiteness of the paper coming through and picking up those highlights on the tomatoes. So I hope you've enjoyed that and found it useful. I'm quite pleased with the painting I've done, I think. It's a little bit off, the drawing of the jug, it's a bit quirky, but that's quite nice in some ways. And like I said before, those tomatoes really do jump out at you because they're the reddest and brightest thing on the page, but that's how it was, so that's fine. So I really look forward to seeing your still lives, things that you can find around your home. If you've any questions in the meantime, please do drop me a line. You can get in touch with me via my website. I've got all my contact details on there, or you can use Instagram Messenger, which is a good way of getting in touch with me, and you can contact me here on Skillshare as well. So any questions at all about anything that we've talked about today, please do get in touch, and I really look forward to seeing all your work, and of course I will give you feedback on that as well. So let me know what you think of the course, and let me know indeed if there's any other courses that you'd specifically like me to do, any particular subject or style or technique that you might want to know about. Okay, so thank you very much, and I'll be back with you again soon. Bye bye for now.